should start.
Okay, so we're going to get started now. We'll let other people come in as we get going. We'll start with our introduction and welcome. So welcome to everybody to join this Herefordshire Meadows webinar this evening, Opportunities for Transition to Profitable Livestock Farming. And we're delighted to have Russ Carrington with us as our speaker this evening, and I'll introduce him in a moment. We have with us so Liz Price from the Winehouse Foundation is very kindly hosting the meeting and has done all the tech and the behind the scenes stuff for us. So a big thank you to her for doing that. And we've got Lucinda Lewis, also from Winehouse, and a Herefordshire Meadows member, who is helping us coordinate all the questions this evening as well. So we've got Lucinda with us. We have Fran Keogh from the Hub, who is recording, who's here. And also helping behind the scenes. And I'm Caroline Hanks from Herefordshire Meadows, and I'm chairing this evening's meeting. So we're hoping that our chairman, James Hawkins, will be joining us shortly. He's doing what all profitable livestock farmers are doing, or some are doing now, and receiving some new cattle which have arrived about 6 hours late this evening. So he'll be joining us shortly. So just wanted to say, so this is a great opportunity at a time of quite a lot of uncertainty at the moment, with so much going on at the moment, with not just with COVID, but with Brexit and subsequent changes to trading and agricultural policy. And we really wanted to take an opportunity to look at how people are feeling about how things are now, and where we can go in Herefordshire to respond to those challenges. I suppose in Herefordshire it's fair to say we have additional challenges with the status of the River Wye and the phosphate levels in the River Wye, which are causing concern, having huge implications to the economy of Herefordshire, and also the flooding situation as well. So there are a lot of challenges we know facing us, but this is an opportunity for us to think about how we tackle that and how we move on from here. So it's great to have so many of you with us this evening. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go through a couple of bits of house rules, if that's all right. So the way we're going to run it this evening, for those of you who've done webinars before, then you'll be familiar with this. And for those of you who aren't, if you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and hover over the bottom of the screen with your mouse, you will see that we have a Q&A and also a chat section there that might be hiding under more, depending on how much stuff you've got up at the bottom of your screen. So in this webinar, we're keeping the chat, please, for any technical questions that you've got, so that Liz will keep an eye on that if you're having any technical problems. And if you're not going to take part in the polling that we're doing, then please do put your comments to the questions that we're going to ask you in a minute in the chat. And you can chat, you can put in other comments and chat in there if you want to. But what we're asking for is for the questions, any questions that you arise, you think of, and that you would like to be put to us at the end of his presentation. We're going to have plenty of time for questions. And please type them as shortly, briefly as you can into the Q&A, and Lucinda will pick those up and put those to Russ later on. So the chat is for chat and technical points and the answers to the questions if you're not going to use your phone or your computer, and the Q&A is where to put the questions that you'd like to be answered to Russ. So it's all anonymous what we're going to do now. We just thought it'd be a really good idea to get the feeling of this group, if you're okay to have a try at this. I'm going to share my screen now, you are going, hopefully it's going to come up. So you can see now we're going to use this polling. So for those of you who've got a mobile phone, you can switch on the camera and put the phone over the QR code reader here and follow the instructions on your phone to take you to the polling page. If you do that, it'll take you away from Zoom to that polling page a little bit on your phone, and you can start to answer the first question. For those of you who aren't going to use a phone, you can take the link to another web page from the chat. So if you go to the chat section, the link to this to another web page is there, and you can just press on that, click on that, and it will take you to that page. And you'll see the first question displayed in a minute, which I'm going to start now. So alternatively, if you want to go to another page, you can just type in vvox.app and then this 9-figure number here, and you'll be at the first question. So hopefully everybody's doing one of those things now. And if you're not going to do either, you can put your answers into the chat. So I'm opening the first question now. So this is the question. It's going to be anonymous, your answer. So what support is needed to help farmers face the challenges of the future? So if you want just to type in your oh crikey, that's question 2, bother. Okay, we're doing this question first then. What support is needed to help farmers face the challenges of the future? So if you just type in, you can type in individual words to what you're thinking of. You put a space bar, or you can put send. If you're still on Zoom, you can see the answers coming in. So the words coming in, very interesting here. So if I say them out, it might influence what you're putting. Anybody else got any? We'll just leave it for another minute, maybe or so. So this is your initial feelings about what support might be needed. Okay, that's good. You can either hyphenate between if you've got longer words to write. Okay. So unless one of the other panelists shouts and says that people are still typing lots of things in, or there's people in the chat having difficulty, I can't see that at the moment. I can close the poll in a second. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah, that's fine,
to do that? Okay, fine. I'm going to stop that, close that poll then. Thank you very much. So to stick with that, I'm going to move now to the first question that we should have done at the beginning. Going to open that poll. So here we go. So the other question to ask now, before you come back to Zoom, is to get a flavour of how we're all feeling about the future of agriculture in Herefordshire. So again, this is anonymous. You just choose one of those where you are now. So very optimistic, a little bit, indifferent, not much, or not at all. If you could choose one of those, I'm going to share the results. They'll start coming in. Okay. It's interesting. So it's still changing. People still adding in. Okay. Anybody else to go? Give you another few seconds for those of you there. Okay, so I think this probably is a glass half full group at least. So interesting. So can everybody, if you want, either if you can see that on your screens, or we're going to run the third question, but that'll be at the end of after Russ's talk. So if you'd like now to come back, I'll stop sharing. If you want to come back to Zoom, well, I'll leave it there for a while so that you can see. If you come back to Zoom now, and leave the program open, that wherever you are on another page, you can leave that open for the third question. We can go back there at the end. So that's very interesting. I suppose, yes, interesting answers that we've got there. So it helps to set the scene. So, okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now, and then we'll come back to put up Russ's first slide, if that's okay. And I'll run the introduction. So we're delighted to have Russ with. Thank you all very much for taking part in that. I think it really helps to set the scene for this evening. So we're delighted to have Russ with us this evening to give us a presentation. It's long overdue. You've been doing so much travelling and things, Russ. Herefordshire Meadows, I'm sorry it's taken us so long to get you here, but it's great that you're with us at last. So thank you very much for being here. So Russ is a Herefordshire man, as you all know. He's been very involved in lots of things going on in Herefordshire over the years. So with young farmers, being a director of the Rural Hub for a long time. And then lots of you will know him from the fantastic work that he's done at the helm of the PFLA also for a number of years. And whilst he's been doing all that, he's been working at European level as well with young farmers and internationally too. His work at the moment, he's the coordinator of the Global Grass-Fed Alliance, and he's now working as a consultant across a whole load of different issues, all related to regenerative agriculture. And I'm not going to spoil the introduction, but he's got very exciting plans for 2021 coming up, which I think he's going to tell you about in a minute. So thank you to you, Russ, for coming and talking to us this evening. I think that's it. I'm going to hand over to you, if that's okay, to start your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and good evening, everybody. Really interesting to see the results of the poll, and yeah, really optimistic group, which is good. That's what we like to see. And thanks, well done for Caroline for doing that, and also chairing tonight. I understand the planned chair is, as Caroline said, still unloading cattle, but maybe we'll see him later. So really, my talk this evening is going to be centred around livestock farming and predominantly grazing ruminants in that, but we will also consider some more broader issues before posing some questions about where we go on from here. So hopefully I can move on. So when we think about cattle farming, for example, or beef production, we can look at it in how it performs for our businesses, and that there's a cost of production, and what we're able to maybe sell it for is our margin and our profit. And this week the price of beef nationally is about £3.80 per kilo deadweight, and that's providing quite a good situation for farmers to make a small margin profit on those enterprises, on the sale of beef. However, back in the spring, when COVID was really hitting in sort of April, May time, prices were down to £3.20 a kilo. And of course, if that's below the cost of production, then there's a representative loss there for farmers selling beef. And over the last year or 12 months or so, the average price has been around £3.50 per kilo. And that's a sort of fairly steady 5-year average, and it's fairly well documented by AHDB and the likes that that sale price is below the cost of production for most beef farmers before any farm subsidy is paid. So this is a really interesting state of play for the beef industry, and to some extent sheep as well, as we face challenges of the future, reducing subsidy, Brexit, trade impacts, and so on. So I just wanted to set that scene really, and think about how that could change and how our margin could improve with the two things that we can impact. And those two things are our cost of production, how we might be able to bring that down. And the second thing is the sale price, and actually how we might be able to increase that. But to change those two things requires two very different skills, and so I wanted to explore both of those tonight, and really perhaps pose some points for consideration and for us to ponder on and explore further in the Q&A as well. Now, moving from where we are at the moment to an improved and increased margin is going to be no quick fix, and it's certainly been the case that there's been diminishing margins for farmers for a very long time. And this study from Canada actually looks at this situation since the Second World War. And you don't have to worry too much about the print that is probably hard to see at this stage, but it basically shows how the gross farm revenue on Canadian farms has increased. That's the top line, the dots. But actually the net farm income over time has reduced. So although the productivity has increased, the profitability has reduced. And really what this graph is saying is that that's a result of the introduction of new technologies and new equipment that has sort of taken that margin. It's added cost for farmers, and it's taken that margin away from the farmers themselves, and it's lined pockets of others that are working to support that production. And arguably maybe there's some good in that, but it also paints the picture that this is the situation for the farmers and having diminished margins. So what we can actually do about that is something we want to explore, particularly tonight. So up until recently, as Caroline has said, I've been managing the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, which is a community of grazing livestock farmers. And we started it some 10 years ago now from a small group of just 12 founder members. And now we're a group of over 600 grazing livestock farmers right across the UK and Ireland. And this community of farmers really is a movement, and it thrives on knowledge exchange between the members, sharing best practice and helping one another out, but also working to champion the benefits of a pasture-based approach for grazing livestock. And so as a result of a lot of the work we were doing for the last 10 years, we developed a brand and certification mark for our livestock. And that was called Pasture for Life, or is called Pasture for Life. And we upgraded it eventually to a certification mark, and it's the UK's only certification mark for 100% grass-fed livestock, and that's owned and managed by Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. And farmers that wish to comply to this voluntary standard can get audits and have inspections to verify that their livestock are working or being raised according to the Pasture for Life standards. And one really key consideration we've had over the years is about how that entity, that certification mark, sits within these three important facets: the market, farm practice, and science. We positioned it and defined it to try and be best balanced with what's viable and practical on farms and works, what's robust and credible in respect of the science that supports the way these animals are managed, and something that is also demanded in the marketplace from consumers. And it's been a huge learning curve, and to strike this balance has required a lot of research and consultation with members, farming producers, consumers, and working alongside with scientists as well. And it's been a very exciting journey to see how this farming model can really deliver in these three important ways. But since I stepped back from my position managing that organisation, I've become involved in setting up the Global Grass-Fed Alliance, which has introduced me to a number of other similar organisations around the world that are championing a grass-based approach to livestock production. And I'm just sharing some of their logos here from South Africa, Sweden, Italy, USA and Estonia. And there's some really common themes that are emerging from all of these organisations that are working in parallel in their own countries. And one of the things is that within a supply chain, which I've illustrated here very, very simply, is that maintaining integrity and certification through the supply chain, from the raw material producers on the left through to the final consumers on the right, is actually really tricky, and it's hard to maintain that integrity at each step of the way. And around the world, it's very common that many products are actually moving through very few processes in the middle there, and this actually makes these supply chains quite risky and causes pinch points that can block or prevent or be a hurdle for getting product integrity, something special, through to that end consumer. And that's no different here in the UK. When we look at meat supply chains, the number of abattoirs have been greatly reducing over the years, and so it can be quite a challenge to get a premium product through that supply chain. But it's also a lesson here in how pull and push marketing can work. And the idea behind push marketing is that from the left-hand side of this chart, producers are pushing product into the market and actually through a narrow point in the hourglass. Whereas pull marketing is about driving demand on the right-hand side that sucks and pulls product through the supply chain, through the narrow point. And actually pull marketing, if it can be achieved, is actually far more effective. And so as a farmer organisation championing an approach and having developed a brand, we were doing an element of pushing, but at some point we realised it was far more effective to change our focus from what was at the end of the farm gate, but go right to the high street and start understanding consumers, what it is and what it means to them to have a product that's special and maybe worthy of a premium, and how we could get them demanding it from their retailers, their butchers, their supermarkets, so that those businesses are then sourcing it back from the wholesalers and the meat processors. So it was very interesting to then change that focus and start to think about that. Again, I learned a lot, and actually really how much difference it really makes to have shoppers on your side, and the decisions that they make, albeit en masse or individually, can be huge. But of course, there are many influences on consumers at the moment and on society in general, and how they behave and what they choose to do. So I'd like to explore that a little bit, really, in particular with thinking about a particular trend which has caused lots of debate and controversy lately, and that's really the rise of people wishing to choose to stop eating meat or dairy products in some cases. So I'd like to just pose a question to the chat, if I may, and you can hover over the chat function and type any words, but I just wanted to ask anyone that's wishing to share, why do you think some people choose to stop eating meat and dairy? I'd like to have more answers there. I'll just wait for anything to come in. Hopefully I haven't sent anyone to sleep yet. So the question is, why do some people choose to stop eating meat and dairy? Misunderstand the role of animals in climate change. Okay, yeah, good. That's Caroline. Probably because of the climate change issue. Peer pressure. Trend, yeah, good. Environmental concerns. Health, animal welfare, climate change. Misinformation, especially from the BBC. They don't like killing animals. Animal welfare concerns. Great. Well, everyone's very clued up on veganism. That's great. Living in a location where they don't easily have access to high quality meat. Doing the right thing. Great. Perfect. Thank you for your quick answers there. It's really interesting, actually, when speaking to people that choose to eat in this way, the different motivations. And I've had some very interesting conversations with vegans, vegetarians, or other people following other diets, and it's really interesting to understand their motivations and the information that is actually getting through to them. And so traditionally the main driver of veganism was on a health basis, that people were choosing to not eat meat and dairy because they felt it was better for their health, and we can only respect people's decisions to do that if they wish. And animal welfare has traditionally always been the second most popular reason why people choose to eat in that way. And they make some good cases as to why that may be, around the slaughter of animals for human consumption and how they view the ethics of that. But certainly the rising trend, as many of you had alluded to, is the climate change debate, and that has now become the biggest driver of change for people choosing a vegan diet. But some new research has been published actually just a few weeks ago that is suggesting the bigger trend now that's happening is people unconsciously choosing vegan food because the vegan advertising has become very, very good and far more exciting than traditional meat products. And so people that are not necessarily advocating veganism or calling themselves vegans or vegetarians are choosing these products because they appeal to them, they grab their attention in the supermarket aisle. And I think that's something we really need to bear in mind, and perhaps we'll come back to that a little bit more. But it's really interesting to see how that's beginning to change. But really what I'm saying is, how can we actually learn from that? How can we sense what people's interpretation of what farming is doing, what livestock production is all about, to improve our messaging, to make things clearer. But I just wanted to delve into the climate topic a little bit more. And this chart here from the USA, and there's many such charts available, shows the split of greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And as I said, there's various charts, and they all sort of slightly alter in terms of their exact figures, but nonetheless they're pretty similar. And so citizens, society look at this sort of thing, and they want to think about what they can do or take action. And everybody wants to do something now about greenhouse gas emissions. David Attenborough and Greta Thunbergs of this world have really motivated people to take action. So they might have looked at this and think, right, well, I can change my light bulbs to a low energy light bulb, and it says on the pack that I can reduce that light bulb's energy consumption by 91%. That's great. They can maybe buy a new car that claims to be more efficient, does more miles to the gallon, or maybe even invest in an electric vehicle. They might be doing some recycling. They might have switched their energy supplier to a renewable one, and that energy supplier is telling them how many tons of CO2 they are saving. They might have insulated the loft and already measured a reduction in their heating bill. So they're making lots of measured changes and things they can tick off on this chart. But when they come to agricultural land use, it's quite clear that some people don't necessarily know what to do. They're not actually sure how they can impact the emissions from that sector, but they can see that it has a link with the food that they eat. And so they then listen to the prevailing information, which is about how, as shown here, those emissions are sourced for the agricultural component of global emissions. And the really big one here is enteric fermentation, which is the fermentation of carbon in the intestines of animals. So principally ruminant animals. And that enteric fermentation results in the emission of methane and in CO2. And so that forms a big part of these emissions, looking at it in a CO2 equivalent manner. And as well, manure left on pasture, again, that's associated with animals and synthetic fertilizers, and so the list goes on. But really the big one there is linked to ruminant animals. And so people are then making conclusions about what's not right, or what they need to change if they're going to affect their personal carbon emissions relating to food and agriculture. And so delving into these charts, they're sort of led to believe that this is what cows do. They roam around our fields emitting huge quantities of methane, and it's not an uncommon understanding, as I'm sure you're all aware, of what people now think. And there's actually various research that's been done looking at the global warming potential of different protein sources, which this chart shows here. And it shows beef to be so high, lamb and mutton second highest compared to so many other protein sources. And this is peer-reviewed research, and it is very convincing to people that it makes the choices they need to make quite obvious. It's a sort of quite a straightforward indicator to them about what they need to change in their diets. But I'm sure by now you're thinking the same as me and as farmers, is this a load of old bull? This doesn't seem quite right, because it doesn't seem to make sense with the way that we are observing and managing our land and seeing the vital role that these animals actually have. And it also throws the question around whether meat is being scapegoated, or particularly beef is being scapegoated for being a scapegoat for the rest of the industry, which also has some equivalent and big emissions. So just to delve into one of these, there's a common debate around which emits more. Is it transport or livestock? And normally when I'm talking about this in a room of people, I'll be asking you for your thoughts, but often most consumers on the street believe that livestock emissions are greater than transport. And I just wanted to delve into that a little bit. And that's really comes from a report that was published by the International Panel for Climate Change that looked at the direct emissions of livestock versus transport, and found that direct emissions were around 5% of the total and transport 14% of the total. That same study also did a study on the total life cycle emissions of both livestock and transport, which I've shown here. And life cycle emissions basically takes into account the whole life cycle of that animal production system, right from planting of seeds at the beginning, the ploughing, setting up the grassland systems, the animal, what that emits itself, and then the processing of the animal products, be that the beef or leather or milk, and then how that is then put into a saleable product and transported to the consumer. And in the same way, with transport, it considers the mining of the crude oil, the processing of that, the emissions from the transport whilst they're operating, and then the recycling and processing and scrapping of that transport thereafter. And actually, they struggled to actually define what the life cycle emissions of transport were, but they were able to define it for livestock. And the problem that then happened is that the 14.5% of total life cycle emissions for livestock were compared against the direct emissions of transport, which is only 14%, and hence there was this misinterpretation that actually livestock were emitting more than transport. And the IPCC have now apologized for getting this wrong, but in the meantime, this message has sort of run wildfire into society, and it's become a common misconception. And I would encourage anyone to challenge that belief, but that's where it comes from. And yeah, as yet, nobody's kind of either wanted to or been able to figure out what the total emissions of livestock actually are. And it just shows where there is so much, can be so much misinterpretation. And so I showed the graph earlier about the emissions of protein types. And this is the same chart from the same study that actually, rather than show the highest impact measurement for all of those protein sources, it actually shows the range of impacts for those protein sources. And so we can see here that beef is actually a very, very variable product in terms of the emissions it gives off, from a low impact beef actually emitting less greenhouse gas emissions than a high impact chocolate bar from deforested rainforest. So actually, as we're digging into this a bit more, so I think it's not quite as clear cut that the consumers and society might have first been presented with. And so it's a really key thing for us to start to understand what low impact beef might look like and how that might be quite useful for us to change the science, change the facts around the contribution livestock are making. And so as we look at low impact or low impact lamb, and that's something, that sort of sector I've really been working in with the pasture fed livestock associations to really understand what that low impact looks like. But this diagram here gives quite a good model and description of that, and it shows how ruminant animals are an absolutely crucial and fundamental part of the natural carbon cycle which exists in our Earth's biosphere, and that cow or that sheep is a tool for perpetuating and mobilizing the carbon in our grassland ecosystems. And so the way that it works is that the cow eats grass. It's a specialized animal with 4 stomachs, able to process grass or fibrous leafy material, which is otherwise unhelpful to us as humans to eat. And it specializes in turning that into meat and milk and leather or wool. And as part of that process, it then emits carbon and methane and carbon dioxide, as I already alluded to. And that goes up into the atmosphere. And in fact, methane breaks down over 10 to 12 years into carbon dioxide and water. And that carbon dioxide is then reabsorbed by the grass plants as they're growing as part of photosynthesis. And in the process, that is helping those plants to grow, and it locks carbon into the soil as well. And so this cycle has continued for thousands of years, and it's actually what's built our soils in many parts of the world. And it's taken carbon from the atmosphere, stabilized the atmosphere by locking up carbon in the soil, and these animals have helped that to happen. But this balanced carbon cycle doesn't necessarily happen very often at the moment, because this cycle only happens in balance because it's working with nature, but because there are no additional inputs from fresh carbon sources such as fossil fuel sources, and there's no mechanisms necessarily by which the carbon from the soil is released. But as soon as, for example, ploughing happens and carbon is released from the soil, this puts this cycle into imbalance. Or as soon as fossil fuels are used to produce grains or soya or other feeds, it creates an imbalance in this cycle. So part of the thinking behind the Pasture for Life ethos was, how can we get as close to that natural carbon cycle as possible with minimal inputs, so that we're not introducing new carbon into this cycle, and we're maximizing the amount of carbon that is being sequestered into the soil. And that's in many ways still very much theory, because as I said earlier, most animal production is not in a sort of true natural situation at the moment. But there are farmers around the world, and I wanted to just quickly cite White Oak Pastures, run by Will Harris in Georgia in the USA, who's done a really detailed study, which you can see here in fine print and is worth Googling. And he's done a detailed carbon study of the emissions from his livestock, but also understanding the sequestration he is achieving on his farm. And so he's finding that his net total emissions are negative. He's actually sequestering more carbon than he's emitting. But what's really interesting is in this side box here, is he compares those emissions with other alternative meat products on the market. And what's really interesting is that the so-called Impossible burgers and soybean burgers that claim to be so much better than beef, and on average they are, but actually he's showing that they're not as good as his pasture-raised and regenerative farm as in terms of sequestering carbon. So he's trying to demonstrate a true picture, and actually where I reference the sort of difference between low impact and high impact beef, just what can be achieved. And this is really important, because if we throw the baby out with the bathwater, in that we get rid of all beef, we get rid of the very animals that could help us to lock carbon away and help us reverse climate change. So I mentioned regenerative agriculture. Will Harris at White Oak is a big proponent of that, and regenerative agriculture has become quite a buzzword in certainly recent months, even, and certainly this year. And there's sort of blockbuster movies being made about it now. But I just wanted to recap on what that might actually mean, because there are lots of different definitions or opinions on that. But I think it's always good to consider a spectrum of agriculture, and on the left hand side we might have desertification, and on the right hand side we might have rewilding. So places of desertification, for example, in Saharan Africa, where land is depleting and it's turning to desert, and then on the other end we've got places a bit like the Napa state, where they've got a rewilding program and there's a great amount of nature recovery. Now we could say that in the middle somewhere is what we might call sustainable. And that is that we are maintaining the status quo, and everything's stagnant. It's not changing, but it's there. It's kept in perpetuity, and it's sustainable. But to the left side of that line, we are degenerating, and to the right hand side, we are regenerating. Now, it's also well evidenced that actually most agriculture in the world at the moment is generally on the left hand side of that sustainable line, and there is evidence that our soils are being depleted, watercourses are becoming polluted, and that land use is, in some places quite quickly, in other places more slowly, is degenerating. So I show this graph really in a way. Regenerative agriculture doesn't necessarily have a strict definition. It's more about a direction. It's more about going somewhere, and it's not about saying we're going all the way to rewilding, but we're taking lessons from rewilding, how we can use nature and recover nature, but also sequester carbon, regenerate biodiversity, improve human health, animal welfare, and regenerate so many different aspects of what land use and agriculture entails. So I think it's important to think about that as it's a direction rather than something specific. But I will just explain, what it might look like in a livestock context. One thing is that biodiversity is really key for regenerative agriculture. So having as many species as possible that are on a pasture or growing in a pasture can really help give diversity to wildlife. It can give diversity to the diet of animals, providing lots of different points of nutrition, vitamins and minerals of different amounts. But what's going on above ground is always mirrored below ground, and actually enabling different species and plants to grow alongside one another actually enables us to grow more dry matter per hectare, per pasture, and enables roots to go down at different depths and interact and bring up different minerals and vitamins that are useful for the health of our livestock and therefore the health of our human beings. And this chart on the right here is of some prairie grasses in America, and it shows the little sort of black line, which I can probably quickly just point out here. That's ryegrass, Italian ryegrass growing there, and the other grasses are some of the larger species that are existing on the prairies. And so they are, if they're allowed to grow to their sort of full height, they can actually create and produce so much useful dry matter. And these systems really are synonymous with these great grazing herds that we still see in the Serengeti with the wildebeest, but also to a lesser extent now the buffalo and the Great Plains of North America. And those animals have been grazing those grassland systems for thousands of years, and as I mentioned earlier, have been a key part of locking away carbon into the soil, and those grassland systems exist very sustainably. And so part of livestock, regenerative livestock farming, is trying to mimic some of the biological systems that exist in these two examples. But the other crucial thing with regenerative agriculture is actually being able to measure what we are regenerating, because it's no good being able to say we're regenerative farmers if we're not actually able to evidence and demonstrate that what we're doing. And I know Carrington Powell is on the call tonight, and this is something he said when I caught up with him last week. It's maybe not right for us to make claims if we can't evidence them, because everyone else is able to evidence them. I mentioned earlier about changing a light bulb. You're going to know how much energy that's going to save you. If you switch to renewable energy, you know how much tons of CO2 that's going to save you. So we've got to be able to evidence as farmers what we are regenerating, what we're doing for the environment. So what does all this mean for livestock farming in Herefordshire, and why is all this sort of relevant to what I've been saying? Well, as Caroline mentioned, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's some starkly scary things on the horizon. Still a little bit unclear what's going to happen on the 1st of January with Brexit and any impacts to our future trade deals, the impacts of climate change, how that's going to affect what crops we can grow in this country, what diseases we have to deal with, what weather patterns we have to adapt to, shopper behaviours, what more are they going to do? We've seen huge change in consumer behaviour this year, red meat being a classic example where that's really taken a dip and then a sudden hike. And then the profitability of all of these things mixed in together, which has been a real focus for tonight. And so it can be very daunting and overwhelming to think where we are now, and actually how we have right across the country business models, farming business models, which are very dependent on EPS, farm subsidies, and how we can actually move from where we are. And to be quite honest, it's a little bit scary and overwhelming. And I love this this picture, which I think captures the scariness of it sometimes. And it is potentially a dark place and a worrying place. And we know that mental health is a big concern for agriculture. And so how do we get ourselves from this situation to a better one? And so I came across this sort of the thought process behind change and how change happens, and it's a sort of psychologically based theory that goes along the lines of us being satisfied with the status quo, but then change is imposed upon us, and there's some denial about whether we actually want to accept that, whether it's actually relevant to us, our businesses or our work. And as the change continues to ensue, that there's usually some resistance to that change, and maybe we don't want to be having any part of it, we don't want to be associated with this change or adapting to it. But at some point there is a tipping point, which is the low point of this curve, the sort of lowest point of the morale, and at some point there's a spark that something could grab your attention and be worth exploring, and actually thinking, well, maybe this new situation could work for me, it could work for my business. And as people explore this, and they can develop hope, they can really see how a new solution could work and how they can adapt to a new situation, whatever that may be. And at some point, if that continues to work out, there's an element of commitment and sort of permanency around adapting to a changed situation. And what's really interesting in this curve is that the point of commitment, the sort of human morale, is so much higher than it was in the first place when we all thought we were satisfied. And this is a sort of theory that's rolled out in the corporate world, talking about the change process. But I came upon it and I thought it was quite fitting, but actually I sketched out my own version. I felt that this was a more appropriate chart for the journey, the farmer journey towards regenerative agriculture. And there's actually so many bumps in the road and ups and downs and things that make life difficult, and then other things that make it helpful. And I've seen many of these happen in real life with the farmers I've been working with in the past, and since I finished with the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, I'm now supporting and doing consultancy and coaching work for farmers and other actors in the supply chain to help move towards more regenerative systems. And it can be a really up and down journey for people, but it's a journey worth going on. And I absolutely love this quote that was given to us by Gabe Brown, another regenerative farmer from the USA, on a webinar last week, and he cites his neighbour Don Campbell for this quote. But he said, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. If you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. I think this is very pertinent because we are running complex businesses in agriculture, and we're facing a complex time with all of the challenges ahead. And so we do need to have a sort of go back to first principles. What are our goals as a business or as a family or as an individual, as a lifestyle, and how does that fit with the future? And that does require some deep thinking. But I wanted to give a quick example of how this might happen in Herefordshire in respect of beef or lamb or other livestock in the county. So just returning to our model that I shared at the beginning, where we have our beef production and a cost of production to do that, and we're hopefully making a margin, a reasonable profit, because we're doing everything we can to be producing a good quality product and keep our cost of production as low as possible. And then maybe as a mixed farm or a farm with a few different enterprises, we might have look at this chart with all of our enterprises across this chart, and actually they all have their own associated costs and they all have their own associated income or sales value as well. And I'd like us to just think about having an enterprise, which you might have for other enterprises, arable or cider fruit or sheep or whatever, but I'd like to have a think about having another enterprise, which we might consider a sort of new enterprise that's going to be more and more relevant for the future. And we might call this enterprise public goods delivery. And that's our enterprise for delivering stuff for society, whether that be carbon sequestration or increased biodiversity, cleaner water, cleaner air, what have you. We might look at it as an enterprise that has its costs and its sale value or its income value. But let's let's consider that bringing those two together in our sort of total farm business model performance, and how the two enterprises there, say beef and public goods delivery, can work together to be greater than the sum of their parts. So what I mean by that is, if we're going to do some public goods delivery, there might be a lot of manual work to do there, or cost to plant trees or reseed fields, or plant wildlife strips, or buffer watercourses, or fence off areas. But actually our grazing animals can be tools to help us deliver the public goods. They're so crucial to many of the public goods that society needs. And so if we consider those two enterprises working together, I firmly believe that we can greatly improve the margins. And so we're working together, that it does help to make livestock more profitable than it is now. And I believe that will be the model that we need to really strongly entertain in the future as farm subsidy payments are reduced. And that might be we get paid for that public goods delivery by government, such as through the new ELM scheme, and there'll be requirements from them, and that will certainly be, or the way it's looking at the moment, will be a sort of higher standard to meet than perhaps previous countryside stewardship schemes. And of course we know that budgets are going to be tight, recovering from COVID and post-Brexit, so it's going to require some focus and attention by land managers. But we might also consider that there are other ways to fund public goods delivery, and that might be from various private sources, such as companies that wish to offset their carbon emissions, or your local community wanting to do a good thing for their water catchment. And I was actually struck by a couple of farmers down in Wiltshire that have gone to their local community and said, would you like to invest in a wildflower meadow and set aside some area on our farm for wildflower meadows? We'll send you pictures and updates. We'll graze it with our livestock, but we'd like to involve you in funding the biodiversity of that patch of land. And they have netted, I believe, £1,700 per hectare by following that model. They haven't rolled it out on the whole farm yet, but they're seeing just on a few hectares how profitable that can actually be, and for £25 a year, how much their local community, individuals from their community, really value what they're doing and get to experience that. So I think there are other ways to think about how that might be delivered. But it really does work. And just to finish, I wanted to highlight this document called Pasture for Life Can Be Done, which is something we developed within the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, analysing the economic performance of around a dozen farmers across the UK, and it analysed in a standard way, in the way that AHDB would do it, in a benchmarking sense, how those businesses are performing against the rest of the industry. And there were some really good signals within that. And the common themes were that costs of production really can be reduced while still producing a premium product, and that costs are essentially reduced by maximising the feeding from grass. And there was some side research which showed that per calorie intake, the cost of feeding with grain is 4 times the cost of feeding grass. And equally, feeding that same calorie with hay or silage, conserved forage, is 2.5 times the cost of that animal feeding itself at grass. And that takes into account all of the spreading of manure, all the sort of costs, infrastructure costs that are involved. But it's true to say that per calorie, feeding grass rather than grain is 1/4 of the cost. And that is what makes these grass-based systems actually more profitable, reduces the cost of production. And premiums on products at the end of the day is perhaps another topic for another day, but there's great opportunities now as people are looking for products with better ethics, reared in ways that they believe is right for them. Productivity may be less on a grass-based system. There's less animals being produced off a particular farm, but it actually is the fact that there are no ghost acres being used in the production of those animals. And by ghost acres, I mean other acres that are not counted as part of that farm. So acres that may be on the neighbouring farm where grain is grown or other forage is grown, or even acres or hectares in Brazil or where rainforest has been taken down, they're acres that are often not counted, and they're called sort of ghost acres, and so it's not necessarily a fair comparison. And at the end of the day, there's the old saying that productivity is vanity, but profitability is sanity. And I think that's been so crucial to the conclusions I've come to in the work and research I've been doing over the years. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was some interest. I look forward to your questions, but I think Caroline has one final poll for us to do before we get on to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Russ. That's fantastic. Thank you. Great presentation. They're giving us lots to think about. We've got some questions coming into the Q&A. So if anybody wants to type in more questions, Lucinda's going to get those together in a minute. Should we just do the final oh, sorry, that's not good. Sorry, folks. Right, so the final question, if you can get back to either to your phone or your mobile or the other screen that you were looking at, this is the final question that's coming up. So I'm going to ask that now. So the question is...
You need to share your screen, Caroline, I think.
Oh, I'm really sorry, Russ. Yep, come on, here we go. Right, so the questions coming into the Q&A, which is great. So if anybody wants to go back to the question screen, the final question for us to think about is, hopefully this will stimulate a load more questions as well, is, if you can see this now, is what can Herefordshire Meadows, Farm Herefordshire, so that's the partnership of other organisations in Herefordshire and other organisations working here, do to help a transition to sustainable livestock systems? So if you can add your comments to that now, please, again, single words or hyphenated words, whatever, so they're coming in. We can see that on the screen here. Interesting ideas about what we might need more of. Help with that. More comments to come in. Okay, but since we've got everything from working in groups, peer-to-peer interactions, some people put branding, supply chain, so very, very wide and broad range of things. I'll get Russ for you to comment on a moment. We've got a few more people still typing in, I think. So I'll give you another half a minute just to add some more words if you've just arrived there. Okay, very good. Right, it's your last words to go in, please, now. Excellent. So I'm going to close the poll. It's very good. So anybody, if you want to come back to Zoom, then you can see the results there. Good, really, it's a wide range of ideas there. Excellent. Okay. So thank you very, very much for that. I'm going to leave, shall I leave that one up on the screen? We're going to come back to the panel. Liz, what are you going to do next? You're going to bring us back to the panelists.
Yeah, we could just go to the Q&A now if you want to stop sharing.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, good. So I'll stop sharing and we'll come back to the Q&A then. Thank you everybody for doing that. Fun, and we can see that. So good. So we've got some questions in the Q&A. Lucinda, do you want to have the first question ready for us as the questions coming?
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So we've got a few questions coming in. The first one came in from Carrington about the role of small farm abattoirs and the cost of them, really. I don't know if you know much about that, Russ.
Yeah, I can have a go. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of conversations going on at the moment around how we can address the closure of abattoir situation and the impact that has on our supply chains. And so one solution is to look at mobile abattoirs, which is the idea of a abattoir infrastructure being on a lorry or a couple of lorries and moving around the country to specific sites where there might be some layerage facilities, facilities for processing waste, where the slaughter process can happen on farm, or small collection hubs for a group of farmers. And it's quite an exciting idea because it makes lots of sense in terms of animal welfare, in terms of food miles, but it's difficult to make it work economically. And I've been looking at a model in Sweden where they've had one. There's another one in Italy that's being trialled, and they're quite costly to set up. But there's applying with the regulation. Complying with regulation is a challenge, to be able to have everything in a small space and to make it doable. But it's certainly practically possible, and I think the sort of costs for a mobile unit are sort of starting at around 200,000, but operating that could be a challenge as well. And actually how everyone's paid to do it, the multi-skilled of a lorry driver who's also a slaughterman, who's also a meat inspector and a vet, could be difficult. But that's not to say it's not possible. And how that affects the cost the farmer might be paying for the slaughter will no doubt be higher, but actually if it saves a journey of 40 miles to the nearest abattoir, it still could be very interesting. I know it's quite relevant in Herefordshire because the only abattoir now is up at Lenfordine, but equally it's very interesting for some of the Scottish islands are looking at it quite seriously as well, because a lot of them have lost their local abattoirs. So all animals are being shipped off the islands to be slaughtered elsewhere, miles and hours away. So yeah, I'm sure something's going to happen at some point, but economically that's going to be the challenge.
Okay, thank you, Russ. We've got a couple of questions about regenerative farming, about how closely it's associated with organic, and how many farmers in Herefordshire are actually turning towards that way of farming now.
Okay, I might let Caroline answer the second part to that, but the principles of regenerative and organic do sit alongside very, very well together, actually. I know, for example, with the Pasture for Life scheme we developed, that also worked and fitted very well with organic. And there was always good dialogue between the organisations, and the farming systems just sort of gelled together very well, but they offered a slightly different element. There is a new scheme being developed in the USA at the moment called Regenerative Organic, which sort of is a certification to combine the two things. I think that's great if there's measured regeneration that is happening. But as I said earlier, my belief is it's a bit more about a direction rather than something that can have a stamp or a label. But yeah, I think there are some pinch points though. I know, for example, I've been looking at pastured poultry systems where the organic regulations now require, at least from the Soil Association, require that free-range poultry have at least 5% natural cover in the pasture, which is really trying to mimic natural systems for poultry and those jungle fowl and being part of agroforestry systems and what have you. But for farmers that are trying to follow cattle with poultry in quite open pasture, that isn't then organically compliant, but it is very good for regeneration, for parasite burden, for scratching around, spreading of dung, and being part of that pasture ecosystem. So there's a few pinch points like that that could be a challenge as we all explore it. But maybe Caroline has a better idea of how many are working in this way in Herefordshire.
Oh, I was hoping you'd know. You know, but we've got I don't know. We've got Charlotte on the webinar, haven't we? Here's how many members there are in Herefordshire of the pasture fed. But so Lucinda has actually been works with a group of some of the farmers are on this call here. So with the group we've got a discussion group going amongst people who are on this journey basically in Herefordshire, people who are starting out, and some people who've been using different regenerative principles for a number of years. So that's already going on in Herefordshire, and I think I think, as you said, Russ, I mean, the definition of regenerative farming is so broad, isn't it? So I think it's quite hard to say, but I would say that there are more and more people every year who are adopting these principles in the arable sector and on mixed farms and on livestock farms. So I wouldn't know how to. Lucinda, do you have an idea? Lucinda or Russ, back to you.
Well, certainly the WUF team works all over Herefordshire and up into Wales as well. And all the time now we are talking to farmers who are looking at ways of integrating regenerative techniques into their more traditional farming systems. So there's a lot of people looking at it. Yeah.
I think, as I mentioned, the crucial thing is, it's not one thing saying that we're regenerative farmers, but being able to actually evidence it. That's really crucial. And I think, in terms of a bigger vision for Herefordshire, or an opportunity for Herefordshire, is actually being able to work together to benchmark some of these things. How much carbon are we sequestering? And if we're able to say that, we're sort of able to say in a measured way, well, there's 20 of us in Herefordshire and we're sequestering X tons of carbon per hectare per year. That's powerful. That's data that can kind of respond to those sorts of questions.
Absolutely. Okay. So
and there's a couple more fairly specific questions coming in about outwintering cattle, really, about stocking density, whether that would have to go down with outwintering, and about the impact on soil of outwintering cattle.
Yeah, good question. Across the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, there are increasing numbers of farmers that are outwintering or outwintering some livestock, and it's not something everybody can do. We're all in farming in different climates and on different soils, and it can be a challenge. But in some ways, it can be an end goal, because the costs of outwintering can be so much lower than housing animals and bringing feed to them and then having to muck them out, and then all the associated costs with building steel and concrete that go into that. But really, what happens is a sort of pathway for people, or farmers I've worked with at least, towards getting there, is that they are able to get better at their pasture management through rotational grazing and things like that, and they find that they can sort of push the shoulders of the season out. So they're actually able to turn out sooner in the spring, and they're able to graze for longer in the autumn. And so if they keep on pushing, at some point they think, right, well, we've only got a 3-month winter now, maybe we really go for it and adapt our system to be able to outwinter, and that's a sort of stepping stone. But some people have gone in the deep end. They think, right, we're going to adjust our stocking rates, we're going to get the infrastructure in place, we're going to do things like bale grazing, which I know Rob Havard has talked to some of the Herefordshire farmers about before. So you can plan ahead, way back in June, July, August time for your outwintering. So you've got the feed stockpiled and they're ready, so those animals can graze and forage on that, but then move on quite quickly, so they're not actually hanging around to damage or poach the soil and cause any environmental issues. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I've got one of my own actually, Russ, if you don't mind. If successive British governments continue to pursue a cheap food policy and allow meat imports from countries with lower food standards than our own, or production standards than our own, do you think there's a political will to develop export markets for our superior meat products?
Yeah, I think there's huge political will to export, and that's kind of, I think, it's associated with economic growth, and it's seen as a really good thing to do. Personally, I think it's better to feed who's closest to you and then keep supply chains short and uncomplicated. But it's certainly an opportunity for us if we're going to have to look at those options, if we sort of pushed out in terms of cheaper imports. And quite frankly, we have a diverse society and a diverse range of consumer behaviours and consumer preferences and consumer affordabilities. And in some ways, you could say that's a challenge of society. But people on low incomes, they may not be able to afford some products, and we have to accept that they may choose to eat cheaper. There's a whole other conversation there about education and healthy eating, but yeah, it may have to be part of the mix in the future. And it's difficult for us to say we don't want to accept cheap meat from abroad if we want to be exporting back the other way. Trade works both ways, should work both ways. But just on the just quickly on the beef situation and Brexit, I mean, it's likely that beef prices will rise as a result of Brexit, because Great Britain is such a consumer of beef. It consumes more beef than it produces on balance. So if there are any trade tariffs for beef coming into the UK from Europe, as a lot of it does at the moment from Ireland or elsewhere, then it's going to make British homegrown beef more valuable. The opposite is true for lamb and sheep meat, but it could really change things. But I think over time the tariffs will balance out. There were new supply chains formed, and it won't be long lasting. But that's what people are predicting.
Okay, and there's a question from Sarah, which is probably for Caroline, really. How long does it take to change pasture into more biodiverse ecosystems, and is it a costly process?
Oh, wow. Crikey. Ross, do you have anything to say on that? I was going to ask you, we'll come back to how many of the pastures that you see around the country when you go around are really flower rich and diverse permanent swards, as opposed to the ones where you've got to keep reseeding, putting a new herbal expensive mix in every few years.
Well, I think there's lots of ways to go about it, and depending what your starting point is, there can be the sort of plough and do a full reseed with 25 different species from a Cotswold seeds mix or something, and there you've got your mix from year one potentially. Or there's the sort of slower but perhaps more secure way of changing the management of the land and letting the land and the plants live full lives and actually able to set seed and flower, which is all about that important rest period between animals grazing them, and both things work, but they have different costs. And actually, what's more long term is creating the right conditions for the diversity to prevail. And so, diversity in nature doesn't like to have an undiverse management system where plants are always grazed to within an inch of their death and don't get a chance to express themselves and flower and put roots down. So you're not going to get diversity there. But if those pastures have rest, they have a change of management, they have different mouthpieces grazing them. And by different mouthpieces, I mean different animals, different species that graze in different ways. So cattle tear, sheep nibble, and horses can make a difference as well, and deer. So there's really interesting lessons from the Knepp estate about that and rewilding, what's happening there, because they've got sort of 5 or 6 different mouthpieces working away. That can make a difference as well. But I've been to farms where the farmers haven't done any reseeding, but they've changed their management, and within a year they said to me, well, I haven't seen this plant since I was a boy, and here it is growing in my field, and it was there all along. The seed was there, it just didn't have the right conditions to grow. So I think nature can recover extremely quickly. And I know when I visited Carrington last week, some of the changes he's doing to some of the land he showed me, already within a year, there's a visible change according to what he was saying. I'm sure
that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you, Russ. That's really interesting, because I think so. With Herefordshire Meadows, we are working with people who might be changing. Some people are changing their management systems. Other people have hay meadows that they have been rested throughout the season. They've traditionally been managed as hay meadows, but the diversity is not as great as it could be. And so we are, in some different methods, introducing seed from local seed sources or from Emmersgate or truly native British seed in those situations, and re-establishing wildflower meadows that way. So that's it's more costly. It can cost you up to £600 a hectare to acquire the seed and do all the works that are necessary. It can cost you as little as £150 a hectare if you've got your own machinery and you're bringing in some hay from a nearby hay meadow. So if you want to see the different methods and their costs, then yeah, please ask us about that. It's very variable. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a bit like people see great results with this kind of work, but it takes 4 or 5 years perhaps to get anything like an increased suite of flowers coming in. And Russ mentions within 1 year, one species is showing, perhaps you see a bit more ribwort plantain or a bit of cat's ear that you haven't seen for ages, and then it'll take longer for the rarer plants perhaps to come back as the soil changes and balance. So
it's worth it's worth remembering how animals, grazing animals, can be a vector for reseeding as well.
Yeah.
In the book Wilding by Isabella Tree about NEP, I think it says that cattle can carry around 280 species or seeds, different species of seeds, on their coats, in their hooves, and in their intestine. So they can be a real vector for species as well.
Yeah, great, really good question. Thank you.
There's no more questions been asked.
Have we got one about, there's one from Luke Walters about grazing cattle all year round as opposed to keeping them indoors? Feeding silage through the wetter winter periods. What would be the impact of soil destabilisation as a result? So that leads on for what you were saying before, Russ, where people do people have that experience if they're out wintering cattle?
Yeah, well, if it's not done well, it can go wrong. There's a lot of care needed with outwintering, and it's good if farmers are sure to sort of get the infrastructure and systems in place first. And I know, for example, DEFRA and the Environment Agency, they're very nervous about outwintering and the idea of mob grazing in the winter, and perhaps rightly so, because it done badly, it can cause problems. But that's the thing we need to ensure we learn and we share with one another, and learn to the sort of peer-to-peer learning is to learn from other people's mistakes and not just our own.
Yeah. Okay, very good. We've done the question. We've got another question here about stocking density change. If I switch how much would stocking density change if I switch to all year round grass-fed cattle? This is from Anne Herbert.
It's worth having a look at the It Can Be Done booklet. You can just search that on the Pasture for Life website. And I'll give a typical politician answer here. That it depends. It depends what soil type you've got, where your sort of starting point is for your species mix, and the health of your animals, the genetics of your animals, how well suited they are. So there's lots of factors that will impact that. In my experience, very anecdotally, and maybe you shouldn't quote this, this is being recorded actually, so I can't get away with it, but I would say production numbers would normally perhaps drop by about 1/3 initially, but over time, once this pasture and the soil and the species and the animal genetics are improved, that production can, maybe over 4 or 5 years, actually recover and get back to the level it was, but in a very different input system, which has really been really exciting to see those farmers take stock, consolidate a little bit, and then regrow with a different method. So I don't think long term there necessarily needs to be much impact on stocking rates. And remember those ghost acres. If you're not buying in the inputs from overseas or the neighbouring farm, I think if people worked out the size of their farms and included the land that they're growing their inputs on, and then compared that to a grass-fed system with lower productivity, the per hectareage stocking rate, I think, would probably be quite similar, or at least that's what I've roughly worked out in the past. So it's more about a different way of going about it. And as I said, productivity is vanity, profitability is sanity.
Yes, and the comment has just come in that why is there a concern about cattle poaching a bit in winter when the same field could be rented out for growing potatoes? which may be a fair point. A couple of questions have come in about sourcing wildflower seed. Peter says, can't we seed a small area, then use the seed in future years to increase the area? And a question from Charlotte about whether ordering seed from suppliers is a concern because it might reduce genetic diversity across the country.
Do you want to say something about that to start with, Russ?
Okay, yeah, just to the second point, second question perhaps. Yeah, I think there's a risk of that, Charlotte. You know, we're sort of, a lot of grass seed mixed seeds are grown in France, as I believe, because they've got a sort of better climate for it. And so we're sort of mixing up all these seeds and stuff, and that may not be a good thing for the stuff that we don't really understand about what goes on in the soil and how different things interact. But it doesn't seem to be causing any big problems, and the benefit of actually getting new seeds sometimes is to get some hybrid vigor, and that may not be a sort of long-lasting, give you long-lasting plants, but actually it can give you productive plants that are higher performing than some native species, and that can be very worthwhile for the increase in dry matter it can result in.
Thanks, Russ. Shall I just say, listened a little bit of, we were challenged, weren't we, a year ago when Paul Mutter came to speak to us about thinking about the genetic purity of our wildflowers, even what we think of as native plants. And he got some really interesting catalogues and things from the Victorian area of when they were bringing in bird's foot trefoil seed from Chile and things like that. So I think, you know, there are purists. If you're on a triple SI, you can't do that anyway. If you're near one, or you've got other sources of local seed then that you can use, then in terms of the flowers, then great, and the grasses as well. But I think that probably we need to be pragmatic as well and think about what's the impetus to have diverse swards to do all the good things that Russ has been talking about for soil health and sward health and animal health and productivity, then to get a diverse sward. I'm not saying at any cost, but there are lots of ways to do that, and the right place for the right seed mix, and that's something that we're getting a bit more experience of locally, and we can advise on if people want to know more about that.
And as Geraint says, maybe we are underestimating the value of our natural seed banks there.
Yeah,
there is quite a lot there waiting to pop up if we let it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very good point.
Has anybody else got any other questions?
Geraint had a very good question about the point about the carbon cycle. So Russ, when are you going to get the carbon cycle onto the primary school curriculum as a mandatory whole day lesson?
Well, I can't do it all, but everyone has a local primary school or kids, and they can do some lobbying in their own communities. And I love the idea of the sort of FaceTime a farmer scheme, which I think the Leaf have adopted a little bit now. But as farmers, we just have to engage at every level we can. We haven't been telling our story for too long, and now there are companies that are marketing soya mush to people, to meat eaters, and convincing them to buy their products. And we need to stop that in its tracks and actually tell our great story, because we have got great stories about the role of our animals, our grazing animals, and the vital role they play in maintaining the landscape and balancing the planet's atmosphere as well. So yeah, that's a question back to you all, to when are you going to go and get it on the local curriculum of your local primary school?
Very good. That's a really positive note to end. There's something that we can all do, as well as thinking about what the next steps are for our own businesses. So I'd like to start to round up now and say a very big thanks to Russ for his presentation. I think you've got us really, really thinking. We'll look again at those answers that all the word clouds that came in, and think about the ideas for how we go forward. So there are things that Herefordshire Meadows can pick up. There are things that other members of the Farm Herefordshire Partnership can pick up. So that's a lot of farming and conservation organisations all working together for the future of the River Wye. And the really exciting things we've had, Russ is helping us at the moment to draw up a kind of strategy for where we go forward to help with the challenges that we're all facing, to help farm Herefordshire in that way. And that means all of us as farmers as well. So I think if you think of any more questions that you want to ask, please do email them either to the hub or to Lucinda or certainly to me if you want, and we'll get them. We'll think about those and get back to you. We want, just before we finally say goodbye, there's some exciting things happening in Herefordshire. So you may be interested to know that the PFLA have elevated Herefordshire to a region. They're calling it the Herefordshire region. We're at the centre of a region of, I don't know, of regeneration. And they are looking to recruit somebody as a facilitator to help develop their group, have a group in Herefordshire. So this would be to arrange meetings and farm walks and lectures and other events for their members in the area. And if you're interested in that, please get in touch with us or with Charlotte Wheeler. There's a link that is up on our website, and we can let you know about that. So that's for about a day a week. And Herefordshire Meadows are, I think it's fair to say, when you say, I mean, in a way, the question, it answers itself. Are people interested in diverse swards? And are more people doing that and making more diverse swards? And they certainly are. I think your experience, Lucinda, is lots of people putting them in stewardship mid-tier schemes and things, aren't there? The area of herbal lays and things is increasing significantly in the county.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's on a bit of an exponential curve now.
Okay, thank you.
People are learning from each other. Yeah,
absolutely. And we're finding that people wanting to restore other native swards and create and restore meadows as well. So we're also looking to expand our team, and we're looking for someone to join us, and that's information about that available on our website or from me as well. So there's great, I think there is an impetus for this kind of work in the county, and as Russ has explained, plant diversity is just one part of the regenerative picture. There's the grazing method, there's all of the different things that he's talked about today, and it's very exciting to hear all that brought together so well, Russ, and with your European and global experience to set it in that context. It's really great that you've been able to. Thank you very much for coming and sharing that with us. So I'd like to, so that's a big thank you for Russ. I don't know how we do that on a webinar. We should be clapping now. I'd like to thank Lucinda for dealing with all the questions, to thank Fran for her help, and to thank Liz Price and Wye&Usk for letting us use their webinar facility this evening. Thank you all very much for your help. So it's been great to see everybody. I wish you all I have got some reindeer ears, but I won't some livestock to put on my head, but wish you all a very good happy Christmas, in however you're bubbling for Christmas this year, and yeah, to happy, healthy and profitable 2021. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.